So there was the point when it was initially released where I'm like, oh, that looks cool. And then I ignored it. And it's gone off and it's gotten better. But
hello, everybody, and welcome to the next installment of Azure Cloud Talk. I'm one of your hosts, Alec Harrison, here with Brian and our special guest, Kevin Griffin. How's it going, Kevin?
Hey, guys. Great to be back.
This is not a repeated episode. You have not seen this one yet. Or heard this one yet.
It was funny because Clark is a mutual acquaintance of Kevin, and we shot him a message on LinkedIn that in a single sitting, I think we surpassed the amount of content we've produced with Kevin. So we just had to call him back, get him back on here because he's been dethroned, so he can be back at the top with our most popular guest or our most common guest. So welcome back.
Yeah, if I had to lose that to anyone, Clark is an excellent person to lose it to. So that was a great episode. I enjoyed listening to it.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was one of our longest episodes. I think Brian and I that afternoon just didn't have a lot going on, and we just I feel like a lot of times with conversations, there's like a lull where you're like, okay, like I feel like we've discussed the topic. There's a lull. Everybody kind of like takes a breath all together of like we're done. And I felt like that one, it just kept going, and in a good way, right? Like it felt like we kept talking about new content, new ideas, and it just kept going. So it was long, but it didn't feel long in the moment. We looked up and we're like, oh wow, we've been recording for a while. We should probably wrap this up.
Yeah, we're not going to set the record today.
No. Well, we need reasons to get back on future podcasts, right? If we just use all the content today, there's no reason to ever come back in the future.
Right. Yeah. You don't ever have, if you expend all your knowledge in one sitting, it's like, oh, I'm one and done. But yeah, I think
the whole goal is to not let people know you're out of knowledge, though, right?
No.
Oh, no. I know more than that. I promise.
And that's not even saying not saying Clark is out of knowledge, right? But I think there's a ton of different directions we could go. Everybody is also, it's really different too, because just sometimes when you start a conversation, where it goes, like I know, Kevin, we started with you, Azure Functions, and I think you said you even had a small update for us there, but just where you go with different conversations leads to whole different things. You're like, oh yeah, I forgot about this, that, the other. So I'm interested to see where this one goes.
Me too.
But yeah,
I heard a rumor that it was going to talk about Azure Functions and Container Apps.
Yeah, we've been. So I'm trying to remember what we even talked about on previous episodes. I have this love-hate relationship with Azure Functions. Like I'm actually doing a talk on this next month at the Commit Your Code conference in Dallas, Texas. So it's conference for charity. So if anyone's in Dallas and want to donate to charity and get some technical content, you should definitely go to Commit Your Code. But I'm doing a talk on, I call it my $8,000 serverless mistake. And it's about Azure Functions. And I think we talked about this on previous episodes where we had tasks in Azure Functions that in hindsight, not suitable for Azure Functions, because what ended up happening was the task we were trying to perform in an Azure function was too much for a single Azure function. So we run out of memory. And to combat a lot of this, we ended up moving, or actually I say we, but it was a guy on my team, moved up to Elastic Premium for Azure Functions. So still consumption model, but turned our Azure function into, instead of a very cheap consumption machine, into a very expensive consumption machine. And actually, it wasn't even Elastic Premium 1. It was like Elastic Premium 2 or 3. So even more expensive. And I remember looking at the bill the next month or two, because I don't check our bill all the time. And I went to check the bill. I'm like, whoa, it really shot up there. What are we spending all of this money on? And the Azure cost management system is awful. But you get down into the weeds and go, how did we spend $8,000 on Azure Functions? And Like, all right. You drill down more, you figure out, well, which resource group, which resource did it occur in, and it was this one particular resource. It's like, oh my gosh, I didn't know it was possible to spend that much money on Azure Functions. And I say this as a person who has gone out into the community on multiple occasions, and I have preached that Azure Functions are a great solution to a whole lot of problems.
Mm-hmm.
And you could do a whole lot of work for basically no money. And I think previously the most amount of money we had ever spent on Azure Functions was like $13 in a month. And that's just Azure Functions going nuts all day, every day. But once you add this layer of Elastic Premium 2 or 3, it's substantially more expensive. And that's what was happening was we were running a very expensive Azure function constantly. And it was just one of those cases where it's like, well, it was consumption, but we were consuming a lot. And they charged us for every little microsecond that we were using. And from an architect standpoint, I went, all right, obviously Azure Functions is not the solution to this problem. So we need to fix the problem. And that led us into a whole new realm of, well, then what's the appropriate way to solve this problem? And we ended up looking at container apps for a solution. And this was after a lot of back and forth. Like I've said this before, and I will say this again. Azure used to have a perfect solution. It was called the worker role. They had the solution. They deprecated it. You can't do it anymore. But worker roles in Azure were amazing. They were just these little console apps that you just deploy. And they sit there and they do the work. And it was great. That got replaced with later web jobs. So any app service you run, you can have a web job behind the scenes. And it's just can be a small app that runs in the background. The problem I've always had with web jobs has been they're a little bit difficult to deploy if you've never done it before, because you're not getting the publish profile. You're almost ending up having to like FTP into these machines, and you have to put your web jobs into a specific directory, and it's very cumbersome. And then if you're ever trying to manage these things after the fact, it's like 4 layers deep in the blade in the portal. So you have to go to your app service, and you have to go to your web jobs, and then you have to go into the web job management thingy, and then it's a huge cluster. And we didn't want to go through that, at least not for the things that we wanted to do. And so that led us to container apps. And what I appreciated about container apps was it was kind of the essence of the two things I really liked. Like I liked the worker roles. I like the console app that never quits, but it goes and does its thing. And then you also have serverless or Azure Functions, which is I have 1 thing, 2 things, 3 things I need to do, but I don't need a huge machine for it. And I might need to scale them up or down depending on workloads. And container apps kind of fit that mold, because like my container, the image that I'm deploying can just be a console app. Now that console app could serve up a website. It could serve up an API. It could just be a console app that does stuff in a while loop. Like that part doesn't matter. And then you can scale it depending on the workload. If you just need a tiny little machine with a couple gigs of RAM and 1 or 2 cores or a half a core of CPU, you can use that. And then if you need more, you can scale it up. If you need less, you scale it down. And we've been going through a process of taking a lot of our very heavy Azure functions. We've been breaking them out, and we've been developing them into container apps and building a CI/CD pipeline around those, so we can create images on the fly. We can deploy those when we're ready to do testing. And that process knock on wood, it's working really well. And we're not at the point yet where we can compare bills. Like, did I really go from an $8,000 bill to like $100 bill? That, like, theoretically, that's what's going to happen. But we're still in the process of making that move. And I've been really happy with container apps from a developer standpoint.
So when you say container apps, you're using Azure Container Apps, right? Not
That's
like
right.
AKS or
No, yeah, just Azure Container Apps. Because we have very specific tasks, and they're not interrelated. I don't, from the research I've done, and I might be missing a lot of points, I think AKS is overkill for some of the work that we would be doing. So we're just using Azure Container Apps by themselves. So it's one image, one deployment. We're keeping things pretty simple.
Yeah, that makes sense, because I think especially if you have workloads that do tend to stop, like there's an Azure Kubernetes cluster or AKS, you are paying for that server to run 24/7.
Yeah.
And then where you really get your ROI is basically pushing that to the max, right? Always having stuff running, workloads going. If you spin down to zero ever, like container apps are always cheaper because you can spin down to zero. Whereas the other case, you're paying for a server. You get cost savings too with the servers of where you can buy buy your premium, or your you can pay for your throughput up front. That way, you get a little bit of cost savings that way. But to your point, if you spin down to zero, more often than not, it's probably not worth having a server in the cloud to just run for you.
Yeah.
I've been curious. I always like containers. The closest I've gotten to them, other than just like POC stuff, is deploying to an app service, like a container into an app service. But at that point, you're still kind of like, it's a less cumbersome way to manage a container. But at the end of the day, it's still a server in the cloud running, whether your app is doing anything or not. I tried to do ACA, Azure Container Apps, really early on, but they didn't have CORS capabilities. That's a new-ish feature.
Yeah.
And that was kind of a non-starter for me when we were doing that, is we were trying to use it to host our back end, and then we tried to use static apps for the front end. And when you don't have CORS on your back end, it's really difficult to get your front end to hit it.
Yeah. I'm sure. It's always CORS. Like, CORS is always an issue.
Yeah. So it was like, I can't do anything with this because I can't get my front end to the back end because it has a CORS issue, I guess, unless like my container served both the front end and back end, maybe. I don't know. I'm very green on containers and all that. So it's like, I finally got my back end containerized, and then it was like CORS issue. I'm like, I give up. I'm done. This is too much.
Who needs containers anyway? So, Kevin, you said you're doing CI/CD. Are you also using Aspire to do your container apps? And
I'm not.
Okay. And the second question then, so since you're not, we can move on from that. The second question then is, for your CI/CD, could you describe that process a little bit, like without giving away the trade secrets, but like, what does that look like from the pipeline standpoint, and how you're deploying to container apps?
Yeah, we're GitHub Actions for everything. So the simplest way to put it, we have an Azure function. I'm sorry, not Azure function, a GitHub action that basically runs anytime a new pull request is generated, or if there's a deployment to our master, our main branch. And one of the things that we can do that we support is, if anyone on the team creates a pull request, an image is automatically generated with their application. So we can quickly stand up staging sites or test sites for testing particular features or particular improvements that the team's making. When the pull request is accepted, it's merged in the main, then we go through and we create the latest image, and all that's getting pushed up to a private Azure container registry that we have.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah. And then we don't have anything automated for pushing those into a pre-production or production environment. But we have other GitHub actions. So when someone on the team is ready to go through that process, they'll go through and say, all right, I want to deploy latest to our production environment.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of the things I really like about container apps is it's called going through a revision. So it'll set up the new image, and then it'll do like an on-mag VIP swap, a virtual IP swap to the new image that's running. If there's a problem setting up the new image, it won't make that jump automatically. So you get a little bit of a buffer. You can also quickly jump back to any previous revision if something catastrophic goes wrong for whatever reason. I mean, things happen. And I like that I can do that quicker. We actually find across the board, like doing the images and deploying images that contain Azure Container Apps, that takes seconds compared to our old deployments to app services that would take minutes. One of our main applications now probably takes about 10 minutes to do a full deployment to an app service. And there's a lot of steps involved, but we're doing similar steps for building our images, and those take seconds. So it's automatically time savings across the board for a lot of these apps, because usually by the time we're ready to go live with it, the image is built. It's just it's ready to deploy. So you're just deploying an image. You're not waiting for your build to run. You're not waiting for your test to run. You're not waiting for it to get copied over to the app server, and all the other steps involved. Most of that's already done at the time you're ready to go live. So it's saving us a lot of time.
So would you say revisions are similar to slots or comparable feature to slots, or is it completely different but yet accomplishing the same kind of blue-green deployment safety net?
Yeah, I would say they're accomplishing the same task. It depends on how you use revisions. We're not fancy with it at all. We're running either one version or updating to a new version. But you could technically achieve the same thing as you would with slots, right? You could deploy a new version and then slowly move your traffic over to it.
That was going to be my next question.
If you have health checks enabled on your containers, if something goes wrong, you can just pull all that traffic back. For the things that we're running right now in container apps, we don't care about that, because most of the stuff we have in container apps is for internal tooling. It's nothing customer facing yet. But if we got to the point where we had customer facing stuff, that is definitely something we would use. Let's slowly move our traffic from one revision to another. Sure. And I think you can get as granular with revisions as you could with slots. Like you could have multiple slots and traffic going to slot A, slot B, slot C. Yeah. And even with slots, we weren't that complicated. We had basically we have production. So the main slot, production slot, and then we would have what we call a pre-production slot. And pre-production was everything's production. Let's just make sure the site stands up and passes some of our tests before we just do this VIP swap into production.
Yeah, it's always a super interesting game to play when you do like a staging slot or a pre-production slot, like you're calling it, or UAT slot, whatever you want to call that slot that sits below production. When you're talking about migrations in your database, and then if you're not careful and you need to roll back, what's that look like? What's your recovery plan? So we had a lot of conversations about that lately. It's just been really interesting. So I can see with Azure Container Apps, it'd be a similar thing in my mind. If we're going to do a revision and we have migrations, we almost want to get those migrations into production first.
Yeah.
Just so everything's out there and then there's no need to roll back. Like, even if something goes horribly wrong with the revision, like make everything safe or call the right endpoint on your API or whatever you're doing to make sure that your database can roll forward and you don't have any kind of issues with bringing in new code, however that looks in your organization, right? I am interested. Oh, good.
or we're not even using things like any framework. So any migrations we have to do by hand. We're just not that mature in that part of the process. So one of the things that we do is just for protection is we have a very identical development environment, and we run all of our tests there. We test our migrations there. So by the time we're ready to go into production, we've already ran through the script 2 or 3 times. So it's a mature enough product where database changes are not as likely as they would have been 5, 6, 7 years ago.
Sure.
So that's the nice thing about having a mature product is you don't necessarily need to touch that layer very often, or if you do, you're adding stuff. So if I'm just adding tables, I'll do that at the moment. That'll be done before we go live with production changes, because it's not going to impact anyone who's currently using the site.
Yeah. So is your thing connecting to the database then? Because I'm curious, circling back to the Aspire thing, the whole idea of Aspire is supposed to play really nice with container apps.
Yeah.
And, get the developer experience better, if nothing else.
I'm still trying to figure out who Aspire is for. Okay. And so there was the point when it was initially released where I'm like, oh, that looks cool. And then I ignored it. And it's gone off and it's gotten better, but I haven't gotten to the point where I'm like, oh, Aspire is going to solve all these problems for me that I'm having. And that's mostly because a lot of stuff we have is brownish field. Like if we were doing something new from scratch, I'd probably very much look at Aspire as the way to go. I don't know if they say it's supported for brownfield apps, like migrate your apps to Aspire, and all works magically in the demo environments. But I've done this long enough to know that's not always the case. So for these particular projects, it's not right now, maybe later. We get all the stuff we need now, so I'm not sure what Aspire would give us that we don't already have. And then a lot of that's just my ignorance of I have not spent enough time with the tooling to bone up on what I don't know.
Right.
So it's not a problem with the product. It's a problem with me not spending any time with the product.
So you made an interesting point. Who's it for? And so I would say it's absolutely for people doing container apps, because it is a cloud native target endpoint that it's really going for. But I think where we have this weird thing, I talked to a friend of mine last weekend at Iowa Code Camp, and they are still doing things the way we've always done them. And most .NET developers, and one of their questions for me was, should I invest time for me and my team to learn containers? Because they feel like the game's starting to pass them by. We were joking about, I'm turning 50 next week, so I'm definitely feeling like the game's starting to pass me by, right? So we were kind of joking about it, but at the end of the day, I could honestly just say most .NET developers don't need to move to containers for what you're doing, and it's these the newer scenarios or scenarios where you have a high compute need. But if you're just doing like your typical Farmer State Bank website, right, that just needs to serve up whatever they're doing, and it's not like one of the, I guess I'm sorry, Farmer State Bank, I just, that came to my head first, but a big bank like National Bank that has millions and millions of customers has a different need for compute than a local farm bank that I'm in Iowa, so we got lots of farm banks.
Yeah, Chase Banking has different technical requirements than your local credit union, ABC 123 credit union.
Your local town community credit union. It only serves like a few thousand people.
I completely agree. I think most people just need an app service and a database. App service and storage account. And that's how all my projects have started, right? So app service and a storage account and maybe a Azure SQL database. and things grow in complexity because the problems evolve. And that's exactly what happened to us. Is we started with app service, SQL Azure database, and storage account. And then over time, it's like, all right, well, it'd be really nice to have some sort of key value store. So let's add in Redis. So that made it a little bit more complex. And then we just started ramping up on background tasks. That we have a considerable amount of work that happens behind the scenes. And that was the first time that we were using before that web jobs. So going back to the original conversation, we were using web jobs, and it was a deployment nightmare because there were numerous times where we were deploying to our app service, the main application, and we were accidentally wiping out our background jobs because it would delete the web jobs folder on production. Because, as part of the publishing profile, you can tell it, delete everything on the destination that's not a part of the deployment. And it turns out if you check that and you have web jobs going, it's going to delete your web jobs. So it just caused a bunch of deployment situations, and we had to resolve all those. And that was actually what turned me to Azure Functions for the first time. Was we were maintaining all these different things in the background. It's like, Azure Functions could do this for, at a higher scale, and it'd be a little bit easier to deploy. So we made this huge migration, and then, but like all things, I went deep down the Azure Functions rabbit hole, and I still love it. Like, I still recommend it for a good majority of tasks, but there's a lot of tasks that it's not suited for at all. And so I think you need to find an alternative. And what I like about container apps is mostly, like, when you talk about Docker containers, all that stuff, like, people really don't appreciate when you deploy an image and that image is built, if it ran on your machine, it's very likely it will run perfectly fine up in its final resting spot. It's we ship the computer that it runs on. And you don't appreciate that until you have code that works great on your machine, or works great on your coworker's machine. It works on everyone's machine. But as soon as you hit that publish button, whether that's a GitHub action, whether that's in Azure DevOps pipeline, or it's someone in Visual Studio hitting publish, once it gets over to the main server, and it's got to be built and it's got to be copied, and then it starts up, it might just crash all of a sudden for no reason. And just something along the line made it fail. And you never find that out until you're into minute 15 of a 16-minute deployment. And with images, you usually know a lot faster if you have an issue, or you could test that image locally.
I will say the one time that did not happen, I was working with GitHub Actions, and I didn't realize I was using the Microsoft runner deploying to AWS. The Microsoft runner uses Windows in GitHub. AWS's default is Linux.
Yep.
So my health checks would always fail because the app service would go to spin up, just immediately fall over. And I was like, what is going on? And I was like, this thing can't stand up. And I'm like, I'm running it locally.
Yeah.
I can see the image. I can pull down the image and it runs fine on my Mac, which was weird. But there was just something about the Linux environment. So as soon as I built it and ran it from a Linux builder for the image, worked just fine. It was just like the trimmed down version AWS used for their Linux runner of containers. That was probably a 2-week, like, making me batty issue. Because I was like, if I build this image locally, because, Mac is Unix, Linux is Unix, build it and publish it to my repository, worked fine. It was just like the pipeline itself is doing something and I don't know what.
Yep.
And man, that took way longer than I'm going to admit on camera to figure out. But
I think you just did.
If you're having that issue, just make sure, like Kevin said, that you're running on the same OS at least, especially if you're deploying to the cloud, because a lot of those runtime environments, like, I could pull the image down And it was my local computer was smart enough to be like, oh, this needs like these other things because it was built for Windows, like whatever, we could figure it out because .NET runtime is, universal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It was just the way that the small slim version in AWS was set up that like it just couldn't do whatever translation that my local machine could do. So maybe Azure's better. I don't know. I feel like whenever I'm in AWS land,
better.
It makes me pain.
Doesn't matter what question you ask.
Yeah.
Azure's better.
Azure is
always
better. So I do want to circle back a little bit. So containerization, learning Docker is a curve. And having heard now, maybe you heard Kevin say something or you heard Alec or me say something that you're like, you know what? We have experienced these deployment pains. Let's try to go to containers, but you don't have anybody on your team that knows containers. Enter Aspire. You don't even need a Docker file.
No.
So the hard parts for me of like creating a container usually revolve around the paths in a Docker file, right? And so it's typically like, okay, well, how do I get this Docker file configured correctly to do all the things it's supposed to do to be able to build my app? So you got an old legacy MVC app. I call MVC legacy now, which I don't like because MVC is my favorite technology we've had in years. And
controllers for life, man.
Right? It's so much easier to use a controller. Please. No, anyway, I'm very, very much an MVC fan. But let's say you do have, and you have a team that doesn't really know Docker, doesn't really know how to use images, doesn't really know that. You've got this legacy app and you're having these problems. You're like, we want to try this. And ultimately, maybe this is where Aspire can come in and save the day a little bit, right? Spin up a new Aspire project, put your import your MVC project into it. There may be a few things that you have to figure out around how to inject the right things at the right place in the different projects that Aspire has. But once you get that, you're literally now going to be able to kind of push plug and play, and you'll have a Docker ability to create a Docker image from Aspire without even having to know some of the pain of the Docker file, at least. So there is that, right?
I really like in Aspire, they have service discovery, which I think is insanely useful, where you can say, all right, this Aspire orchestration has Redis, it has storage accounts, it has, it has Azure SQL, it has all this stuff. And then at deployment time, Aspire is going to ensure that you have those resources, and it's going to tell all your applications where to find those dependencies. So you don't it's always a step you have to go through when you're setting up something new, is you have to go look up all the connection strings. All right, how are you doing authentication?
Sure.
Like Azure, once you use Entra ID for everything and have application registrations, and it's all a pain in the ass, and we don't do it. I'm like, where's my connection string?
Right.
Where's my access token?
Connection string, all the things.
Like that's how I want to talk between applications, but that's not secure. But but you want to set up all these connections. So when my web app says I need Redis, and Aspire will go, well, here's how you get to Redis. And it does all that stuff for you and makes a lot of the wiring that you do initially much easier. And so it's nice if you add a new app to your Aspire orchestration, you just tell it, well, you get Redis from Aspire, and it just knows what to do. You don't have to do any additional configuration. And I think that's really nice.
Yeah, Scott was doing a talk on Aspire last weekend at CodeCamp, and one thing he mentioned is that there are a bunch of packages that you can bring in, and just you look for the Aspire, like the name of the package has Aspire, and so like the Redis package would also have the word Aspire in it. And now it's a safe package to bring into my Aspire orchestration. So that's pretty awesome. That it just kind of helps you configure all that, and then the next developer could just pick it up and run. Like you don't have to look up all the connection strings and all the other things, get them set in your local secrets or anything like that.
I really like the built-in telemetry and log management. That's all really nice. That's all stuff we wire up by hand now. And send through serial log to seek, and it's like we have a process for that. So like Aspire does all that out of the box, whereas before we have to go through and do all that setup ourselves. So it's nice that they're solving these problems. And it's one of those things where I think in a year or two, it's kind of like, I would say the same thing for like Blazor, where I didn't use Blazor initially. I still don't use Blazor, but that's not what we're talking about here. It's you just give it some time, it's going to build some maturity, and then it's just going to be the way. And what I really like about just the .NET stack in general is like it's the recommended way, but it doesn't have to be the only way. So there's still 15 other ways to solve this problem. However, if you like to solve it somewhere differently, it's why, like we were just talking about, like I love controllers. I'll write a minimal API for one or two things, but I'm not building a full-blown application with minimal APIs. But that's just how I choose to do it. But
that sounds like a whole other podcast.
Well,
it's the boomer cast right now. We
it
all
is
need
the boomer
controllers
cast.
and
I mean, well, the problem is, and it's like you start, how do you organize minimal APIs? And there's a bunch of people that talk about a lot of different techniques. And usually it turns into, well, if you have more than like 3 endpoints, you're probably building this class that holds them all. Oh, oops, you accidentally built a controller or a controller that's, not a controller. It's just, yeah.
I get that. It was more of a joke, but I think one thing that's interesting too, like other than when I brought it up asking how you hosted your containers, Kubernetes never really entered the conversation. I feel like there's so many organizations I talk to that, we're going to do Kubernetes. And like, hey, your people don't know how to do containerization and container deployments. Your people don't know how to orchestrate Kubernetes or manage it. Like, if your end goal is Kubernetes, start with containers. Like you can, to your point, deploy it in an app service. You can deploy Azure Container Apps, and then you start getting the benefits of Kubernetes. And like, to your point, if you have tasks that don't need to run all the time or can spin to zero, Container Apps is going to be cheaper anyway. It's cheaper than an app service. It's going to be cheaper than Kubernetes because you don't have compute that's running all the time costing you money. You can spin down to nothing. And I think that's where people get stuck is like I've heard the term resume driven development, right? I want to put K8s on my thing because a headhunter, somebody's not going to understand what container development means. They only understand Kubernetes is a hot word that needs to be, put on there. Kind of same with AI, right? Like we want to use AI because we want to say AI is on our resume or it's the hot buzzword right now. But I think I like the way you framed it as here's the problem we're solving. We started with functions. We're moving to containers just because of like XYZ problem. You could have, taken off a ton of dev time, effort, all that, and been like, we're going to use Kubernetes because I think this is great. Like, no, we're doing one step closer to solve our problem. And guess what? That's good enough. We don't care about Kubernetes at this point.
Right. You don't have to write all that YAML configuration, get your clusters running
about
correctly.
Helm charts, all that other junk. You're like, no, I got my deployment pipeline to a container that's short-lived. It does what it needs to do. It dies, and happy moving on with my life.
I think a lot of people, like, just if you're out there consuming content, you'll hear like, oh well, Netflix is using Kubernetes or something similar to that, and you have the 9 to 5 dev out there going, I totally have Netflix problems. Like, so I must use Netflix solutions. Like, well, no, you don't. Like, unless you're working for Netflix, you don't have Netflix problems. So maybe you don't. Like, Kubernetes solves an array of problems that you probably don't have. And so I'm not saying Kubernetes is a bad solution, but like Kubernetes kind of originally came out of just scaling containers was difficult. And like Docker originally just didn't do a good job of it. So like Kubernetes spawns out of just the need for, there are certain organizations that have very weird production architectural issues that they need to solve, and Kubernetes solves those problems. But that doesn't mean you and I or anyone else have those problems. Like, we could just do it in the simplest way possible. And I'd rather get to the point where I say, all right, I have these weird scaling rules, or weird container relationships, or I'd rather get to the point where I go, okay, I have a Kubernetes problem now, so maybe I make the switch to Kubernetes, which is a smaller shift than it would be going from, all right, Azure Functions to Kubernetes. Like, I'm not making as big of a jump. I'd rather make a couple small jumps than one big leap. And so I don't think we're ever going to have a Kubernetes problem. I mean, we might, but we do. Maybe I'll be retired, or we'll be on whatever's next after Kubernetes.
You guys talked about learning too. Like, it can be daunting to see what the next cutting, bleeding edge thing is like, if somebody wants to see themselves getting into Kubernetes, right? Like, start with containerization, start with deploying containers, because to your point, it's hard to jump straight into Kubernetes because there's just so much content out there of like, okay, now I got to learn containerization. I got to learn that way of thinking about applications and projects. I got to think about, versus, hey, just learn to deploy your container. You can still use even an app service, right? Like, your .NET app today can be containerized. There's probably some caveats there, but I'm going to say probably for 90% of people listening, the .NET app that you have today can probably be containerized and deployed to however you're deploying it today. That's an easy consumable thing to start with. And you get the benefits of, like you said, if you have your dependencies in a Docker file, guess what? Runs on my machine, runs on your machine. We shouldn't see anything super crazy.
Right.
So there's benefits you get from that. You're getting closer to, if you do want to be containerized or Kubernetes or, whatever, you're getting closer to that. So you have not only onboarding's easier because it's not, hey, Brian, go download my 52 packages and make sure you're on this version. No, we can peg that in a Docker file. So it's like, just do Docker run. You're then making your deployments easier because it's easier to deploy a container than a whole app, like a container image. And, you're just, a lot of these things get easier without you having to go, okay, let me go learn containers, go learn Kubernetes. Okay, what's a container issue? What's a container issue? What's a Kubernetes issue? What's a, I'm just dumb and bad at software development issue because I'm learning a new skill. So I'm obviously going to be bad at it at first. I feel like it helps get rid of a lot of that pain. So I would totally recommend starting out there. Like, how do you just get your normal .NET app, or to your point, build a minimal API that can be deployed through a container that just says hello world.
Right. So
I think
you triggered a couple things in my head. Not only would you start having the benefit of, the works on my machine goes away, we're shipping the computer, like Kevin said. But you can literally like also put your SQL Server in a container. So now you've got an isolated instance of SQL servers directly for that app, where it's not, your dev machine typically might have 50 different SQL Server databases in it that you're using across all the projects you're working on. This is a SQL Server directly for that specific app and that app alone. You can still do volume persistence on your machine, mount it to the C drive. And so your MDF or whatever, the LDF files or whatever that comes with the SQL Server still gets stored locally. You don't lose that across runs. And then test containers, right? So now your testing can be done. So I think those are some good things that when Alec was talking, it's just like, whoa, yeah. We got to get this out there, right? So
I think it's a real skill, like just getting started, like being able to take an app that you've built. So Alec, like you said, like file new an API or hello world. Like, all right, take that and get that into a container and get the container to run. Like, for like a good percentage of the stuff you're going to do, if you're able to do that consistently, that you have solved the majority of the problems you're going to have, because it's getting the stuff into the container. It's making sure you expose your configuration correctly. If you're dealing with that, you solve those problems. Like, everything else is just orchestration. Like, all right, how many instances of this are we going to run? How do we scale from 1 or 0 up to 10 or 100? Like, those are bigger problems, but just a skill of, can I take this app I built and get it into a container and run that container? Like you've solved the majority of your problems there. And I feel like that's the hardest thing to learn to get out the door. Like, how do you build a Docker file that it takes your code and does it correctly? I still cannot do it right the first time. It's like writing a GitHub action. I cannot write a GitHub action correctly the first time. It takes minimum 15 times. And my commit history will show that. But Docker files are the same way. I always screw up a path. I screw up something. And AI helps a lot with this.
Yeah.
So I use Cursor for my main VS Code editor. And its AI is way better than Copilot. And so I can get a Docker file built very quickly. That's in context of my entire project. In a fraction of the time. It used to take me much longer, but.
So you use Cursor in VS Code or use Cursor's IDE?
I use Cursor as the IDE. So
okay,
because it's basically a fork of VS Code, and its AI integration is so much better. Like I'll switch over to Copilot for something, and I go, oh my gosh, Copilot's so dumb, and I'd go back to Cursor.
Interesting. So you're comparing the AI and Cursor to GitHub Copilot?
Yep.
Okay. Interesting.
I think I have a love and hate relationship with GitHub Copilot. I feel like sometimes it does good. Sometimes I just want to tab and then I have, oh no, here's the entire massive method that I didn't want.
Yeah. So Cursor doesn't do that.
Does Cursor run on Mac as well? Sorry,
yep.
I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, Cursor sure will. Yeah.
Cursor doesn't do that. Go.
So Cursor. So when you're building stuff with Cursor, you can do one or two things. So you can do an inline code question. You can ask it a question. You can ask it to do generation. Its generation is vastly smarter than anything I ever got out of Copilot. The other thing you can do, like its chat feature is much better in my opinion. It has more models available to it than what Copilot has. You can also switch between your models. So if you have if you prefer ChatGPT or any of the GPTs, you can jump to those. If you prefer Claude, you can jump over the Claude. You can also, it does a better job of taking your entire code base into context. You can also index documentation. So if you have a bunch of tools that you use, you can just drop references to them into Cursor, and Cursor will read and index all the stuff. So like when I ask Cursor to do something, I can be very specific with my request, and it will go read the documentation, figure out the best way to solve the problem, and give me a very good solution. Like there's far fewer times that I'm rejecting changes from Cursor. In GitHub Copilot, I'm rejecting every change because it's just bad. Unless it's a one line of code, like autocomplete type thing, where it's obvious what I was going to write next. But whenever Copilot, does here's the entire method I think you're about to write, it's always wrong. Like it's always wrong. And Cursor is like 90% correct.
Wow.
But even when Cursor's done, so it says, this is what I think I should write. You can go back and refine it, and it'll try again because you've given it more context. Cursor, I pay for Cursor. It has just gotten substantially better every update. I can't say the same thing for Copilot. Like I almost feel like Copilot's gotten worse just over time. Yeah.
Interesting. So, I wonder if that's because it's a language model learning from developers, and more developers have started using it and accepting default answers when they should have maybe not accepted default answers. The large ecosystem of Copilot leads me to believe that might be part of it.
I'll tell you, just like the cool things I have done with Cursor, where I have created a new file. So working with Vue, I I would say, I need you to build a view or view template that is visually similar to another view template. So I'll tell it, go look at this file for inspiration. But I need you to use, instead of these fields, use these other fields. And it'll come back and it'll be 95% correct. It like to the point where it just saved me an hour of work, or 2 hours of work. Like it saved me enough time where I'm like, I would pay easily double what I'm paying for this now. And yeah. Oh,
I've been
yeah.
on the fence of buying it, and you're just, man, I've almost hit the buy button a couple times, and you're just selling it to me, man. I don't.
So like, and before I paid for it, I was using it for free, and you can bring your own API tokens from ChatGPT, from Claude and stuff. But what ended up happening was I was spending so much money on OpenAI that I might as well have just paid for Cursor. So that's what I ended up doing was I stopped using my own API key. I started using Cursor's built-in support, and I saved money, and it got better. So yeah.
Is it private?
Yeah, all your models are private. Yep.
Okay.
So, and yeah, like I love. So one of the things I'll do is I'll take different projects that I use. So like, let's use Dapper as an example. You can take Dapper's GitHub, you can drop it into Cursor, and Cursor will index everything in there. So if I ask it a question, I can reference Dapper directly, and it goes, oh, I have the full context of Dapper. I'm not just making crap up. It will go reference all the documentation. It will reference the code directly in Dapper and say, all right, I'm going to give you a very specific answer. And it's usually like 95% correct. Like every time in Copilot, it just, we've all had this issue. You go into Copilot, it just makes up a method that doesn't exist. Or it assumes that the method has 10 parameters when it only takes like 2. I've never had that problem in Cursor. It's always like syntactically correct. It might be having a couple of logic issues, but the gist of it's there. So sorry, didn't mean to derail this into a.
No, I think this has been a great conversation, and we've talked about three different things that I think every developer could benefit from hearing parts of that.
Yeah.
So not derailed at all. I'd never heard of Cursor before, but again, I'm more academic than you guys. So, I'm training all day long, and it's really good for me to hear about tools like this. And like, okay, now I can start looking into that for any, development work I do, or, just to, when I'm training developers, hey, have you looked at Cursor? It might be a possibility that you might be interested in, right? So if there's somebody out there, I'm sure there's somebody out there, but if there is somebody out there who's never heard of Cursor and is like, yes, thank you for sharing that, would you give us a thumbs up or something?
Yeah. I wish I had a coupon code or something, or affiliate link.
Right. Yeah. I was just going to say, Kevin needs to get an affiliate from Cursor. So if you're a Cursor person and you happen to hear this because your algorithm picked up on, hey, there was a podcast that happened to mention your name. Kevin is looking for affiliate codes. He's a really well-known speaker, and he'll mention, I'm just kidding. Not really, but I mean, he's a really well-known speaker. I'm sorry. That all came out horribly wrong.
Just put Kevin down at the end. And
I didn't mean to. No,
that's a wrap, guys.
Oh yeah, and see ya out of here. Just kidding.
It's interesting because like I know the IDE wars have kind of heated up a little bit because Rider and JetBrains products are now free for non-commercial use,
which is incredible for Mac users.
Yeah, right. Because we don't have Visual Studio for Mac anymore. And I know people who very aggressively think that Visual Studio Code is a text editor, not an IDE. Because without a bunch of extensions, that's all it really is.
It's a text editor. Yeah.
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 So,
so I will say, so Cursor is not allowed to use the C# developer kit. So if you're trying to do any sort of debugging or something in Cursor, you can't do it. They won't let you. That's just because of the licensing model around the C# dev kit. I mean, that's just how it works.
Really good unit tests.
So what I do is I'll use Visual Studio. I switched to Writer, so I'm going all in on Writer too for C# development. And what I end up doing is if I'm writing some complicated code and I just need some AI assistance, I'll actually jump over the cursor, load up the folder, and cursor can generate really good C#. Like it'll actually, everything outside of just running the code, it does a great job with. So, but if I need to run through and debug any code that I'm working on, I can't do it in cursor. I have to jump back to Visual Studio or to Writer. So it's the only big issue. And I wish maybe Microsoft will relax on the dev kit stuff, but
I'm curious then. So are you just doing like .NET Run to run your app if you're using cursor then?
I will if I don't need debugging.
Okay.
But usually I'll run 2 apps in parallel. So I'll have cursor here, and then I'll have Writer over there.
So you're saying it's such a good tool that it's worth the pain of having 2 editors open at the same time.
Yep. Yeah.
That's something right there, right?
Yeah. So if I need, because I can tell it, hey, generate a method for me that does X, Y, and Z, and it'll go do it, and then I'll switch and I'll run through it. It's just because like Copilot doesn't even come close. And I haven't really tested too much the JetBrains AI integration. I don't have the license to it yet, so I need to work on that. I've just been lazy. But
so if you're listening to this and you're from JetBrains, Kevin would like a trial license too.
Well, like I get the MVP license. I just haven't renewed it yet, and I'm pretty sure that comes with the AI stuff. So, but I'm like 3 months away from renewal on that.
Okay.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thanks for joining us, Kevin. Hopefully everybody got a little bit of a flavor of, containers, IDE battles. We'll see. I think I'm going to take the leap and get the Cursor AI IDE just because I've seen it around so many times. People talk about how great it is, and I think you finally convinced me. Everybody's like, yeah, it sounds cool, but I've never used it. But you're the first person I've heard that I actually know has used it who isn't, on the payroll of the company.
I mean, if they like to pay me, I'll take it. That sounds great.
If they just comp your subscription, you'll be happy, right?
Yeah.
So
there we
Cursor
go.
AI. Let us know if you want to comp our subscriptions. But at the end of the day, $20 a month also isn't outrageous for what we do.
Yeah.
So
if yearly, it's cheaper. Yearly, it's
I pay for a year.
16 a month.
So
I mean,
check that out. With that, is there any last call to actions, Kevin? Anything you want to give a shout out to? I think you said you're going to be in Dallas here in a month.
Yeah, the Commit Your Code conference. It's for charity, so all the speakers are paying their own ways to get there, and 100% of money earned is going to charity. And there's a handful of charities.
Are you going to be a Code Mash?
No, I didn't get selected for Code Mash. So
what?
I mean, yeah. I am 0 for 3 on conference select acceptances in 2025. I am doing everything wrong, and I'm not sure what. So I gotta stop what I'm doing and regroup and try a new tactic because I have not been able to get selected to anything.
Okay. Well, we should have a conversation offline and see.
Yeah.
What are we doing? Like, let's look at each other's abstracts and figure out what's going on.
Yeah, I don't know. It was all fine until I came on this podcast. I mean,
oh no! Oh no!
No.
Daniel Ward has gone to a few NDCs post podcast, so I think, not saying it's a you problem, Kevin, but
I was accepted to NDCs before this podcast.
Oh no!
Oh no! Gotta ask. Follow up with Daniel now.
If you want to go into any NDC, do not come on our podcast.
Yeah.
The Azure Cloud Talk curse is what we're gonna call it.
No. We are not a Madden football game from Xbox.
Awesome.
Sorry.
Well, it was great chatting with you. guys. We'll see everybody again next week. And Kevin, see you when ever Clark or another guest dethrones you on content.
No, we can't wait that long.
Okay.
Until next time.
Sounds
guys.
good. See ya.
See you. Have a good weekend, guys.
Bye.